Parliamentary sovereignty is a constitutional principle that states that our legislative body, Parliament, has absolute authority to create legislation which cannot be challenged. In 1896, Dicey set out that the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty had two main aspects, the first being that Parliament can make any law, and the second being that no one can override or set aside Parliament's law. This was further reinforced with the Parliamentary Act 1911, which meant that legislation that denied Parliament the right to legislate would be impliedly repealed by a later statute. Essentially, no Parliament can bind the previous Parliament. This is mainly reflective of the fact that we don't have a written constitution in the UK, and this is a dominant characteristic of the flexibility of our uncodified system. However, this traditional principle of parliamentary sovereignty has not gone unchallenged, and has in fact been tasked with many difficulties and obstacles. The biggest challenge of them all is arguably the introduction of the European Communities Act in 1972, which saw Britain enter into the European Union. Indeed, our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is famously quoted as saying, "You cannot express the sovereignty of Parliament and simultaneously accept the 1972 ECA." But like every statement that comes from Bojo, we must also question and dissect the validity of this. The ECA gave direct effect to EU law and meant that if there was a conflict between an Act of Parliament and EU law would prevail. Not only did EU legislation take vertical effect between the state and an individual, it also took horizontal effect, meaning that it could get involved in disputes between two private entities. This has created much difficulty for the courts on striking a balance between giving credence to Europe and also satisfying the principles of parliamentary sovereignty. This meant that English courts then had the power to strike down an Act of Parliament if it conflicted with EU law, an almost judicially enforceable boundary to the powers of Parliament. In the significant fact obtained case, it was decided that any national law coming into effect before or after the ECA could not be applied by the British courts if it contradicts community law. A specific challenge to parliamentary sovereignty was the provision set out in Article 3. Any question as to the meaning or effect of any of the treaties shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles laid out by the European courts. Using this, English courts had an extreme scope to interpret legislation as widely as they liked, so long that it was in line with the EU law, allowing the judiciary more flexibility and thus greater power. In R versus Jackson, Lord Steyne stated that the principle of parliamentary sovereignty is no longer absolute. However, in this, he is not distinctively saying that the principle of parliamentary sovereignty no longer exists, just that it does not exist in the rigid form that A.B. Dicey has first suggested. It now potentially exists in a more self-embracing format. Take this as an example. If I lend you my earrings to wear for an evening, I am not permanently giving up my ownership of earrings. I am merely sharing them with you. In the same way that sharing sovereignty is not the same as saying that it is lost. The traditional doctrine perhaps falls short, therefore, in defining the relationship between domestic and international bodies of law. However, this shift in a self-embracing attitude towards parliamentary sovereignty is not shared by everyone, and some, specifically Eurosceptics, will only accept parliamentary sovereignty in its most pure and absolute form. So let's return to the Bojo quote. The only way that a member state can refuse to give supremacy to EU law is if they repeal the ECA and withdraw from the EU. Indeed, let's go back to the Parliament Act. If no parliament can be binding on another parliament, then the ECA could be impliedly repealed, which leads us on to the most turbulent political upheaval in Europe of the recent era, Brexit. Despite the extreme political turbulence and upset it has caused, a referendum, 3 prime ministers, 2 general elections, and an extremely divided country, what does the result of the EU referendum actually tell us about the state of parliamentary sovereignty in the UK today? Mark Johnson draws the analogy of the Brexit referendum being almost like Schrodinger's cat. It acts as a catalyst to lift the lid and see what is left of parliamentary sovereignty that Dicey originally placed in this hypothetical box. One of the most notable points of interest to come out of the Brexit shenanigans was R versus Miller. Here, Gina Miller sought a court decision that meant that only Parliament could trigger the United Kingdom's exit from the EU. The Miller judgment made Parliament itself the single most fundamental and politically legitimate authority to trigger the UK government's post-withdrawal negotiations in the EU. This itself was heralded as a return to a form of traditional parliamentary sovereignty. But can full traditional parliamentary sovereignty become the most defining feature of the British Constitution again? It is really difficult to tell. Whilst EU membership has been seen as the most significant challenge to the original doctrine, it could also have been seen to have had a catalytic effect on the judiciary, whereby they have become more powerful or more willing to set legally enforceable limits on the power of Parliament. Today, it is very clear that debates about whether parliamentary sovereignty is subject to legally enforceable limits found in the rule of law have a life of their own outside the context of the EU. The power and autonomy that the EU allowed our national courts to take can perhaps never be overridden. This suggests that we are leaning towards a period of legal constitutionalism, where the courts are perhaps at the top of the food chain and have ultimate control over our legislation.